right, guys, I think we're about ready to get started. Just before we do, uh, after the question last week, Arthur, I think you're a little bit loud. I'm just going to mute you, okay? Um, after the session we did last week, one of you actually texted me another question, which I'm going to answer for all of you now. Guys, don't be afraid of asking questions, even if you think it's a stupid one or whatever. It's not, and a lot of other people might be interested in it. So the question was whether we can find Nebbiolo anywhere else other than Piemonte. So yes, you can find Nebbiolo elsewhere. I've had Nebbiolo from South Africa, from Australia, from Virginia as well. But to be fair, they are nowhere near their Piemontese counterparts. So they're okay, they're decent, they still represent what Nebbiolo should be. But it's just not elegant enough. It doesn't have the same sort of feeling. So when it comes to Nebbiolo, I would strongly suggest, if you like the grape, stick to Piemonte, at least for now, until they find a climate that will suit it better. Okay. All right. So let's get started with today. We've got Tuscany to cover through today. A little bit more in detail, I would say, than what we've been used to with other sessions. So yeah, let's just get started. So historically, Tuscany was one of kind of the first big regions in Italy. It was first mentioned with the Etruscans. So Etruscans was one of the civilizations in 8th century BC. So they were supposed to be the first people that kind of started cultivating the wild vines that were here. So remember when we were talking about America the other day, when we were talking about the wild vines there, there were wild vines obviously in Europe as well. This is the Vitis vinifera type that we keep on talking about. And Etruscans were supposed to be the first people that were kind of cultivating it. The Greeks were kind of the first that started talking specifically about Tuscan wine. So they were saying, well, if you ever make it over there, you need to try Tuscan wine, that sort of thing. So it was kind of the first real mention in the world, to be honest, about a region that makes kind of outstanding wines compared to the others. Obviously, then there was the Romans, like we talked about. They started planting more and more vineyards. Obviously, they needed it for their own consumption, and then same as everywhere else in Europe, monasteries and obviously the church needed a lot of wine. So they were kind of in charge of cultivating it and using it mostly as well. There was a very interesting business model that started happening in the Middle Ages, and this was the mesadria or métayage in French. In English, this is the most easiest way of explaining it as sharecropping. So what is it? Basically, what it means is I own a piece of land, but I'm rich. I don't care about work, so I don't want to work. So I just give it to a farmer. So this farmer will then cultivate the land for me. And at the end, he will get 50% of all the crops. So 50% goes to me as the landowner and 50% to him. So this was a very, very interesting way of civilization developing, I guess. So obviously the farmers couldn't increase their money because they didn't make anything. They needed those 50% of the crops to survive. And the rich just got richer because they didn't have to do anything. They didn't need all of that food, and they obviously had much more land at the time. So an interesting system, but it actually affected the way. It's one of the main reasons why kind of the Italian wine was relatively slow compared to the French. Like with the French, we were talking about, they only used métayage in kind of the smaller provinces, not in Bordeaux and Burgundy. So they were able to kind of expand much faster. But yeah, Italy was a little bit slower to that. That's why I think the French are more successful in the world of wine, I guess. In terms of a particular wine, so we were talking about the Etruscans and the Greeks and how they were talking about the Tuscan wines. But in the 14th century, there was the first mention of Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, which was a particular wine from a particular very, very tiny region that it was it kind of stood out to people, and it had a real sense of terroir. The interesting thing about the Italians was that they actually introduced a guild of wine salesmen, sort of, um, in 1282. So they were the first people to actually introduce some sort of laws that we know today. So I know we all think that in the past everybody could do whatever they wanted, and they could drink if they were kids, whatever. But in 1282, the first laws were introduced. One was that you cannot sell wine within 100 yards of the church. You couldn't serve children under 15. So this was already then. So that's almost 1,000 years ago that people already realized that maybe alcohol is not good for kids. And then the fun one, for me at least, is you weren't allowed to serve prostitutes, thieves, or scoundrels. So why that's interesting is because they were already aware at that time that wine is a bonus. It's a good thing. It's something that only the good people deserve, sort of, and that's why they kind of banned it from all of the others, and they didn't allow them to join in the fun. There was a negative with that, obviously, because of this. There was a lot of black market already at that time, but yeah, that's a different story. Now, when it comes to Tuscany, the most important person for Tuscany was the Iron Baron. Do you guys know who the Iron Baron was? No, maybe you know him under a different name, which is Bettino Ricasoli. Heard of him? Still not. Oh my God, you guys are horrible at history. Bettino Ricasoli was actually your second prime minister of Italy. So kind of an important guy. And he was famous for being super, super moral, super ethical. He actually, whenever he couldn't make way because he had to pay off somebody, he just quit, which was a little bit sad. But yeah, he was famous for his integrity. So even he was a mayor of Florence, and like I said, he was a prime minister as well. So he did a lot of good, but yeah, sometimes he just couldn't get through the corruption, and yeah, I think he quit like 3 times or 4 times. But because he had this drive, he had this passion always around him, he also wanted to start making wine and kind of introduce winemaking. So he had a little chateau in one of the villages of Chianti, and he wanted to make wine. So he traveled, he went to France, he went to Germany, and he wanted to bring in all of these better grapes as they were known. So he wanted to bring in Chardonnay, he wanted to bring in Cabernet, he even tried Riesling and things like that. And after all of that, experimenting with all of these grapes, he realized that some of the local grape varieties work much, much better. These local varieties were Sangiovese, Canaiolo, and Malvasia, which we still know today. So Sangiovese is the most planted grape variety in all of Italy. So even though it's kind of only famous in Tuscany, it is actually most planted everywhere. You can find it across all of central Italy and even in bits of the south. Now the name carries two meanings. If you have a Latin origin, you will probably get that sang means blood. And originally the word comes from blood of Jove, and Jove was Jupiter, the Roman god. He was the biggest god, right? He was like the Zeus for the Greeks. So it was supposed to mean the blood of Jove. But later on, as Christianity took over, they kind of took on the role, and they started saying that Sangiovese is the blood of Christ, as obviously this was the grape that was drunk. This was the grape that was drunk with the mass. So you can hear it as blood of the Christ as well sometimes. Okay. The grape in itself is notoriously high in acidity. This made it a really weird wine. A lot of people thought that, well, not thought. There was a story that if you didn't do it right, Sangiovese will turn into vinegar, and that's still the case today. Sometimes you will, in the wine world, people will always say If you smell a wine and it smells like vinegar, it's Sangiovese. It does have this kind of a volatile acidity component to it that just kind of smells like vinegary if it's not done right. It's quite thin-skinned, but it does produce quite serious, it can produce quite serious wine. Generally, like Chiantis will be around medium plus tannin. So not quite high, not quite high as, let's say, Nebbiolo that we talked about, but reasonable nonetheless. In terms of flavors, you get like these red fruit, strawberries and cherries. As it ages, a little bit of tobacco kind of evolves. And I personally always get some sort of a savoriness to it. It's like a bit of like a tomato pasta, not tomato pasta, tomato paste flavor to it. Now, the main region for Sangiovese is Chianti. You guys, I'm sure you've heard of Chianti. Chianti is one of the most famous regions in the world. And it was famous for a very long time as being the only Sangiovese being the base grape with 15% or up to 25% even of white grape varieties. That was mostly Malvasia at that time. That has changed since, and we'll cover that in a bit. The other very important region for Sangiovese was Brunello. And Brunello came about because this guy, Ferruccio Biondi Santi, so this guy, it's a family-owned estate in Brunello di Montalcino, which is a beautiful little village. And they isolated a particular clone of this Sangiovese. So because Sangiovese was originally a wild vine, it is a combination of grapes that mated in nature. So it wasn't an intentional cross or whatever. You could get a lot of different variations of it. So there were some clones that were great and some clones that were not so great. And in Brunello, this guy Ferruccio Biondi Santi found the one that really works well in that area, and it actually produced some super rich, super full-bodied, high tannic, very serious wines that we still know today, to be honest. And that's why they kind of started to bear the burden of all of Tuscany on them. So when people talked about Tuscan wine, Brunello was probably the first one that people talked about in the 19th century. Biondi Santi, definitely remember that name. It still exists today. They're still family owned. They still make best Brunellos in the world. Best Brunellos in the world, definitely. A little bit expensive, but obviously with a name like that, with the contribution that they brought to the region, they definitely deserve it. As I mentioned, you can find Sangiovese in central Italy as well, and there's quite a bit of it all over the world. America, California makes a lot of it. You can find some, I think I found some in Chile, Argentina. Argentina was quite a big one for it, and Australia makes quite a bit of Sangiovese as well. Unlike Nebbiolo, it's much better in other countries, so it's much closer to what you would want out of a Sangiovese. It still has those same characteristics, sometimes even a little bit more complexity. And we've got this Villa Ragazzi Sangiovese, which is really well done, really beautiful, really complex style of wine. So Sangiovese, a big part of Tuscany. Without it, Tuscany would not be what it is today. Okay. Any questions about Sangiovese? All right. Now, the other reason why we're talking about the Tuscans are the Super Tuscans. So what are Super Tuscans? So Super Tuscans basically means that a wine in Tuscany is made out of international grape varieties, or is based on international grape varieties for that matter. And the way this started was with a Marquis Mario Incisa della Rocchetta. My Italian is beautiful, I know. So he was this Marquis, he was royalty, and I think he was an orphan when he turned 18 or something. And he inherited a little farm in Bolgheri. So Bolgheri is a little village or little town, let's say, I think about 10-15 kilometers from the coast of Tuscany. so on the southwestern part of Tuscany. Um, and this guy was an agronomist. He went to school, so in spite of being royalty, he still wanted to do good. So he went into agronomy, and he started to grow a lot of crops in Tenuta San Guido. He started making vegetables. He made flowers. He was famous for his tulips, which some say were better than the Dutch tulips. But yeah, he was obviously, because he was an agronomist, he knew what he was doing. So he really kind of refurbished the estate and really made it into a very very wealthy estate. So in spite of him being royalty, he wasn't that rich. Obviously, especially because his parents died very soon, and at that time, because he was so young, I think he was 17 or 18. He was, and the state just took everything off him. So he had to kind of rebuild the money. But still, because he was royalty, he was used to some sort of prestige, some sort of elegance, I guess. And obviously, he only drank good stuff, good wine. So he said, I want to make good wine in Italy as well. And before he did that, he wanted to visit all of the estates that he used to drink. So one of his best friends was Mouton Rothschild in Bordeaux. So before he started planting any kind of grapes, he went there. He tried to see what they're doing. Obviously, his agronomist background helped with that. And he actually even brought some. Well, there's a story that he took the cuttings of the vines from Mouton. Apparently, that's not true. He took it from a different guy in Tuscany. But anyway, he did learn how to do Bordeaux-style wines. And to everybody's disapproval, he started planting Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, all of these grapes in Tuscany, which was a big no-no. Obviously, Sangiovese was the king there, so what the hell are you doing? But he didn't care. He didn't really. His plan wasn't to make money off of this. His plan wasn't to be commercially successful. He just wanted to have spectacular wines that tasted like Tuscany, not like Bordeaux, but still be made in that same style. So I think, so he was making this wine, and obviously he got a lot of criticism and everything, so he never released it. But then his wine became really, really good. So in 71, he finally released a first vintage from grapes in the vineyard of Sassicaia. So the vineyard of Sassicaia, basically means like a stony hill. So this vineyard was, if you ever go to Bulgaria, if you ever go to the town, you'll see behind the town there's a very, very tall hill, and it's a forest basically. So no normal person would go and chop down that forest, but he did, because he said, I want those stony soils because I need drainage. Cabernet won't grow otherwise if I don't have good drainage, and in the rest of Bulgaria, you've mostly got clay and limestone. So he wanted that stony soil. So yeah, he was crazy enough to pull out all of the trees, everything, and just plant a beautiful vineyard. And in 71, he released the first Sassicaia, which was 1968 vintage, so 3 years old. And it was amazing. People started buying it like crazy. I think in 74, 75, something like that. There was even a blind tasting of best Bordeaux blends in the world, and Sassicaia came out first. So similar to that 1976 story we had about the Americans, very, very similar thing happened here. And then in 1985, remember when we were talking about the points? So this Robert Parker guy gave 100 points to the 1985 Sassicaia. So once he did this, everything changed. Suddenly, the Super Tuscans, the international grape varieties, weren't horrible anymore. Suddenly, everybody wanted to have them, and it just changed the landscape of the town as we know it. So in 1994, they finally gave so at this time, because the grapes weren't made with Sangiovese or anything, they had to be an IGT, so Indicazione Geografica Tipica. So no real appellation law to it, because it was breaking all of the rules, obviously. In 94, they finally changed this, and they gave the whole appellation around the town of Bolgheri, they gave them the Bolgheri DOC. So now they can say that, and you know what to expect out of the grapes, out of the wines. Sassicaia is actually quite special because in 2013, I think, it actually got its own appellation as well. So not only is it a Bolgheri DOC, it is a Sassicaia DOC, which is pretty special that a winery is regarded so interesting, so unique that it gets its own classification. So after 1985, because of this 100 points, everybody wanted to drink Sassicaia. So he said, okay, I cannot make enough, and he started producing Guidalberto. So Guidalberto was the kind of the second wine, but not really, because it had the different bits of it. And this is very classic for Bolgheri in general. All of the wineries that are there, they don't make a typical second wine. They don't make a wine that is made from lesser grapes. It is just a different blend. So in the Guidalberto, there was more Merlot and there was a little bit more Sangiovese as well. So it wasn't based on Cabernet Sauvignon. Okay. So that's Sassicaia, and it was the first Super Tuscan. Yeah, there was nobody before them managed to do what they did. That being said, there is this family called the Antinoris. So Antinori family has been around for ages, almost 1,000 years since their first mention. So they were mentioned in 1180, where one of their ancestors was recorded as making wine. A little bit later, I think in 1385, they officially became a business, and they have not stopped since. They are still family owned to the day. And yeah, they were just very successful, very crafty sort of people. They had good connections. They sold wine to Vatican, to the church, to royalty, to everybody. So they made money very, very, very quickly. They also made some enemies. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Medicis. They were this horrible family in Italians. The reason why I mention them is just because I've noticed the funny fact that one of the Antinoris was actually murdered by the Medicis because of love. Horrible. Anyway, but why am I mentioning Antinoris in the first place in terms of Tuscany? So while Sassicaia was the first ones that actually made a difference and the first ones to become crowned as Super Tuscans, it was actually the Antinoris that started playing around with Bordeaux varieties first. So like I was saying with the Sangiovese earlier, the problem with Sangiovese was that it was, if you didn't do it right, it tended to be a little bit flat. It didn't just give enough structure. So Brunello was able to get that, but a normal, like a Chianti, just couldn't. So people started playing around with it, and the white grapes, the Malvasia that they were putting into it, just kind of mellowed it down even more. And that's not what people thought that needs to happen. So one of the Antinoris in 1920 started putting Cabernet in, Cabernet Sauvignon as a blend, just like 10-15%. And this was obviously illegal, and he was still naming the grapes as Chianti. So yeah, it was a big deal that he did this. So they kind of they told him off at the time, and everybody was like, "Oh, I don't want to talk to you anymore." Blah 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 blah. So they were kind of ostracized by this, but they didn't give up. So they went back to putting white grapes in, and the wines were still rubbish, same as most of the Chiantis at that time. But they didn't give up, and they kept on making. And then, as soon as Sassicaia was released, they were like, "Fuck off! This is what we've been trying to do all this time. So we'll do it as well." So Sassicaia was released, and then they started producing a wine called Tignanello. So Tignanello is a vineyard in Chianti, and in 1974 they released the first Tignanello that was a blend with Bordeaux grape varietals. So a first Chianti, technically, that was a blend with Bordeaux varietals. So I think they blended in 15% of Cabernet Sauvignon to the Sangiovese. And the wine was absolutely outstanding, still is to this day. Obviously, that meant that they broke the laws, so they couldn't call it Chianti anymore. They had to call it IGT as well. And they still do to this day. So when Tinelero did this, everybody else kind of jumped on board because the wine was so good. So eventually they changed the laws in Chianti. So now you don't have to put in white grapes anymore. Instead, you are allowed to put in Cabernet Merlot, basically international grape varieties. So Tinelero was incredibly important for Tuscany to kind of change the perception of Chianti that we have today. Now, in spite of those rule changes, like I said, Tinelero to this day, it's still an IGT. It is not a Chianti, even though it is in the region and it does obey the laws these days. But yeah, Antinori's, obviously, this was a very interesting project for them, the Tinelero. It wasn't the only one. They now own, I think, about 15 wineries across Italy and in the New World as well. So very, very important family. One of the most important wines that they have also in Bolgheri, so Tinelero is in Chianti, but they also have a winery in Bolgheri, which is based on their top-end Solaya wine, which a lot of people say that is as good as a Sicaya, sometimes even better. Now that's down to your opinion. It doesn't have the same commercial appeal as a Sicaya, for sure. If you had them at the same price, nobody would take Solaya, everybody would take Sassicaia. But that doesn't mean it's not a good wine. So yeah, these are the Antinoris. Maybe you've heard of one of their wineries, Cervaro della Sala, in Puglia, beautiful white wine. But yeah, that's it. So Tenuta dell'Ornellaia. So Tenuta dell'Ornellaia is another Bolgheri estate. So the way I'm doing this today, by the way, is I'm not doing icons at the end as we used to, but I'm just kind of walking you through the history of of Tuscany, and I'm pointing out all of the people that you should know anyway that are kind of the main icons, because they kind of naturally became legends. They naturally became icons as they did their things. So Tenuta dell'Ornellaia was actually founded by one of the Antinori cousins. So Antinori, like I said, big family, long history, and all of them involved in winemaking. So the cousin of the guy that started Tinelero and Solaya opened Tenuta dell'Ornellaia as well. So that was in 1980. And in 1980, they released two wines. They released Ornellaia, which was kind of the top wine, and there was a vineyard. It's just behind the estate, just behind the house, a little bit further up in the hills, in very rich clay soils, that they decided to plant full Merlot. And this vineyard is called Masseto. And Masseto is probably the only wine in the world that can challenge Chateau Petrus of Bordeaux in terms of Merlot-based wines. It is just something special. And the reason why it's so special is because under Masseto, you've got these million-year-old soils that are full with minerals. And Masseto, because the way the soil is built at the toplands, the vines just dig really, really deep in the ground, and they start to pick up all of these beautiful nutrients that are so old, and they haven't been used before, because if your roots are deep, then you get to access to certain nutrients that you wouldn't otherwise get. And this is what makes Masseto special. It's a very, very tricky vineyard. And yeah, they actually even, it's become such a big name, such a big brand, that they've disassociated it now from Ornellaia. So technically Masseto is not Ornellaia anymore. It is just Masseto. It's its own entity. Last year, they just started building its own winery as well. So even though it's literally 200 yards away from the Ornellaia winery, they decided it needs its own space. It needs its own conditions for maturity and so on. So they've separated it. Okay. So the other big one, obviously, is the Ornellaia, like I said, based on Cabernet. They're famous for having quite a high proportion of Cabernet Franc as well, which is a little bit unique towards the others. Others will focus more on Merlot and Sangiovese, but Ornellaia has a lot of Cabernet Franc, and it is really, really good over there. In the 1990s, they released their wine called Le Volte, which was based on Sangiovese. So again, like I said, it was at that time it was the second wine, but it wasn't a second wine. It was a different wine. So because you had to wait a little bit for Ornellaia to be ready to drink, because it wanted to get that complexity out of it, they wanted something to drink today. So they released Le Volte, which was softer, just a little bit easier to drink. And so even though the Bulgari appellation came along, so Le Volte was never part of Bulgari. Part of it is because they buy grapes from elsewhere as well, but part of it is based on. See, this is what happens when your brother comes in and doesn't turn off your mic. So yeah, that's Le Volte. Later on, they actually said, okay, Le Volte is very, very good, but we need something in between because Le Volte was a very entry level. Even to this day, Le Volte you can get for like 25 quid in a shop, whereas Ornellaia is 200. So they needed something to bridge the gap. And that's where they introduced the Serenove, which again, is not a second wine, is not a third wine or whatever, but it's a different wine. It is based on Merlot. So you got about 60% of Merlot, 30% of Cabernet Sauvignon, and then Sangiovese, Petit Verdot, and all of the other grapes. So yeah, it's in my mind one of the best value wines you can get in Bulgari. It costs around 60 quid these days, but it is stunning. It is one of the top wines. It kicks the ass of most of Bordeaux's in that price range by a mile. So definitely one to try. Funny thing about, not funny thing, but about Ornellaia. So this picture that I have in the back. So this is their oak tree. It's a really cool oak tree. So basically you're in one of their vineyards and they've got like a terrace, like a pad in this tree. And then when you stand on it, you can see all the way to the ocean because the ocean is like 10 kilometers away. And on a clear day, you can see all of it. It's a really, really beautiful sight. But yeah, this is the oak that actually you can find on their labels as well. It's more than 100 years old, so quite important to them.
Lenart, question, but Le Serenove on the label, does it say the Ornellaia, right or no?
On Serenove, yes. So Serenove is also a Bulgari, and it does say that it's a Serenove del Ornellaia. Even Le Volte says Le Volte del Ornellaia. So they are proud of it. They do take it very, very seriously, even if they are. I mean, when I was there, they were saying, they were talking about Le Volte like it's their flagship, right? They weren't talking about Ornellaia. They weren't talking about, they completely avoid the conversation of Massetto. But Le Volte was kind of their baby, and they put so much effort into it because they say, look, Le Volte is what your every man drinks. Right? And if you make that good enough, people will lust for the better ones. Because if you make an entry-level wine amazing, people's imaginations are going to go, wow, how great must the top wine be in that sense. So really, really good stuff. By the way, Ornellaia is really famous for the whites as well. They make a Sauvignon Blanc based Poggio Allegaze, which is amazing Sauvignon Blanc, one of the best ones I've had in a long time. Very limey, very, very clean, very precise. I think last year was the first year they released Ornellaia Bianco as well, which is based on Viognier, Sauvignon, I think even a bit of Petit Manseng. They also make a sweet wine of their own with Petit Manseng, and they make their beautiful olive oil. Yeah, pretty amazing stuff. Anyway, the other of the Super Tuscans, again, Gaia, we talked about him in Piemonte, but he does have an estate here in Bulgari as well. He actually has 2 estates in Tuscany, but the one in Bulgari is pretty interesting. It's called the Camercanda. I really love, he's got a beautiful Fermentino Viognier based white, the Vista Mare, that we list as well because, again, it's just a beautifully balanced wine. But he does make a red, a couple of reds as well. So Gaia, definitely much cheaper option to buy him from Tuscany than to try to buy him from Piemonte, because he's still kind of making a name for himself down here. Tuarita. Tuarita is beautiful. Tuarita is a family-owned estate, and it is biodynamic, completely biodynamic. They're insane about that. And they play around with not just the classic international grape varieties that others do, but they play around with Syrah as well. And they've got, I think, about 30 different grape varieties that they grow. So they're really kind of always pushing the limits and always trying to explore what else they could grow. And yeah, we had a 2007 Syrah from them, and that was it was like a really good Hermitage from Rhone Valley. Really good stuff. Tuarita. Labels are a little bit weird. They look like Michelangelo drew them or something. But yeah, the wine is really, really good. One winery that I should have mentioned more with Sangiovese is Querciabella, but they do actually make Super Tuscans as well. Again, a biodynamic winery, and Querciabella is again kind of an iconic Chianti estate. Shit, can't remember now. The Batar, Querciabella Batar is their white Chianti wine, and yeah, that's probably the best white Tuscan that you will find at the moment. Querciabella Batar. Just a quick word about the horse in the back. I didn't mention him before, but this horse is actually called Ribot, named after a French painter. And the reason why I put it there is because the owner of Sassicaia, the Marquis de la Roqueta, this was his horse, and this horse actually paid. This horse actually got him through, got him the connections that he needed to go to Mouton and all of these things. It's one of the most famous horses in history. Actually, it was. I think it sired I don't know how many champions and race winners. So a really good horse. Anyway, just a bit of backstory for that. Okay. All right. The whites of Tuscany. So like I said, they don't just make their reds. You have some beautiful Vernaccia over there, Fermentino, Malvasia, and Trebbiano. So Vernaccia is probably the most unique in terms of Tuscany. Fermentino is arguably the best quality that you can get. So Fermentino you will find in kind of three parts of Italy. You'll find it in Liguria, you'll find it in Tuscany, you'll find it in Sardinia. Sardinia makes the most of it. Liguria makes the least interesting one. And then I would say Tuscany makes the best rounded quality of the grape. Malvasia, mostly it was just kind of your everyday drinking wine, and like I said, it was also used for blending with the Sangioveses and stuff. And then Trebbiano is just a mass grown grape variety. It can be used even for spirit making and things like that. But it is important grape. It's fairly neutral in flavor. Its French name is Uni Blanc. So basically, you might have heard of it under that name. Uni Blanc goes into cognac making. So good grape, produces a lot of volume, but not very high quality wines. You do need to know something about some other subregions of Tuscany. So Maremma is the bit next to the coast. They make some interesting grape varieties as well. They do white, red, or rosé, so anything can be called a Maremma in that region. Some Vermentinos come from their beautiful rosé stuff, mainly done with Syrah. And yeah, Murellino is Sangiovese. It sits kind of in between where Chianti is and a little bit further southwest towards Brunello. So it's kind of like in between the two villages. And so Chianti, we said, is kind of the lighter. Brunello is the very heavy, and Murellino just sits kind of in between. It's starting to pick up a little bit of attention lately. So the prices are slowly starting to rise, but at the moment it's still cheaper than Chianti and arguably similar in quality. So Murellino is a good segue to get there if you can't really spring for a Chianti. Carmignano, which is the town on the picture in behind, Sangiovese as well. And then you have San Gimignano, which is mainly known for their Vernaccia. So you will sometimes hear of Vernaccia di San Gimignano. Yeah, just again, a lovely fresh wine, bit rounder, I I would put it somewhere in between like a agave and a arnais in terms of feel and flavor to it. Right? And that's kind of it for me for today. So I am ready to take some questions that you might have had.
The other day there was a program on the TV that we were talking about exactly Tuscany and all the wines there. Apparently, but they didn't explain much, so I don't know if you probably know something. There's a kind of like a passito grape in close to Chianti, if I'm not mistaken. There's actually a little pub. It used to be quite famous in the past, but now it's getting a bit away, they said. But I don't know if you know something that you can probably tell us about.
So in terms of the sweet wine, you are talking about Vinsanto. I didn't mention it today because I want to cover that, especially when we go to dessert wines. That's why we didn't put much attention on Sauterne and other sweet wines either. But yeah, Vinsanto, it's a passito method, which again we'll cover then, basically drying the fruits. And yeah, beautiful, very complex styles. Sometimes even aged in very interesting chestnut barrels, which give very, very nutty notes to the wine. But yeah, I mean, what exactly do you want to know about it?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't the Vinsanto because Vinsanto knew that it was kind of like a Muscat from Tuscany, something like that. They actually said it was quite popular in the past, but then it became, because they got Sangiovese and Chianti and everything, it became more like a fourth, fifth, sixth grape, whatever. And no one actually knew nothing about it. But I don't know if that's why I heard. It's like I need to ask him if he knows something a bit more than what they said in TV.
I mean, I'll have to have a look. Not quite sure which one it could be. Could be Canaiolo. Canaiolo was one of the grapes that used to be one of the most important ones, and it kind of dropped back. Um, but yeah, I'll have a look. I'll see if I'm missing something.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Anybody else, guys? Anything I should have explained a bit better?
What's the difference between like a Rosso di Montalcino? When you find on the bottle Rosso di Montalcino, what is mean?
Good point. I should have actually mentioned this in detail. So Montalcino is a village in Tuscany, and the top grapes, the top wines that come from there are from that particular top clone that we were talking about. The clone is called Brunello. So the top wine is called Brunello di Montalcino. Now, similar to Piemonte, there are rules. So it takes you pretty much 4 years to release, or 5 years actually, to release a bottle of Brunello, because it needs to be aged for 4 years in a barrel, then another year in a bottle. So it takes a lot of time before you can drink it. And so they started making a Rosso di Montalcino, which was kind of a baby version of that. It only needs to be aged for a year before release. So it's a little bit softer, a little bit lighter. Generally, it is kind of the second wine, although people do take it seriously as well because it's the one that moves stock a little bit better. But yes, it's a different. It's less aged. It doesn't have that structure that would come from the oak. It doesn't have the same sort of power that a Brunello would have. It's just a little bit fresher style. But yeah, still very good value Rosso di Montalcino as well.
So do you think 55, like let's say 55 pound of Biondi Santi Rosso di Montalcino is worth it or not?
Yes, anything from Biondi Santi is worth it.
Yeah, but you're not aging. You won't age that much.
Well, look, you need to understand that by law it has to be aged for a minimum of 1 year. It doesn't mean it is only aged for 1 year. Biondi Santi won't age it for 1 year. They will keep it until it's ready. So when we talk about these laws and the minimum aging and stuff like that, we are talking about what is the minimum amount of time that the wines will be ready for, right? So, but the people that really are good winemakers, they will. So it's same as with champagne. Champagne has to be aged for 15 months, but it can be aged for much longer if the guys decide. So, for example, some of the top chateaus will age their wines for 60 months, for example, because they know they need it. Same with Beyond the Santis Rosso. I can guarantee you it's not a year. It's a lot longer.
No, this is a 2014 one. So
yeah, but it's not the current vintage still. Probably it was released in 18 or 19 or something like that. Definitely they kept it for a few years. But again, this is a way, Italians are very good at this, at understanding that the wines still need to be approachable, because if people can't afford you, sooner or later you will go out of favor. So they're willing to lose money. So when I was talking about Ornellaia earlier and then Le Volte, so they're willing to lose money on Le Volte just to keep people happy and to keep that sort of connection with the buyers, basically. So their cheaper wines are very, very important to most of Italian wineries. By the way, one thing I should have mentioned with Ornellaia. So when I was talking about it being started by Antinoris, that's not the case anymore. So Antinoris then sold half of it to Robert Mondavi Winery, the Americans that we were talking about. And Frescobaldi. So Frescobaldi is another very famous Italian wine family. So the Mondavis and the Frescobaldis owned Ornellaia for a long time. Antinoris don't anymore. And then when Mondavi was sold to the Constellation brands, Frescobaldi bought the rest of it. So now it's owned by the Frescobaldis. Okay, so nothing to do with Antinoris anymore. Just to make it clear.
But only the Ornellaia, the rest is still under.
Only the Ornellaia, yeah. So like I said, Tenuta dell'Ornellaia was not founded by the core of the Antinori family. It was one of the cousins that started it. So it was a good idea because he traded on the name. So it gave him a bit of a head start. And he founded it, and he's the main reason why Masseto exists. But yeah, they moved away from that, so it's not theirs anymore.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Guys, anything else?
No, thank you.
Okay. This presentation is already on the website. I did it a little bit earlier today. So you can already download it, and the video, same as usual, will be up 4 or 5 hours as soon as it kind of renders and stuff.
Thank you so much, Lenart.
Cool. Okay, next Tuesday, Veneto and Friuli and kind of rest of that Italy.
Oh, all right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Cool.
Nice weekend.
You too. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.